Welcome to today's session of Ask the Trainer. My name is Chris Sousa. I'm the fitness coordinator, fitness officer at King Campus. I'll be joined today by Mike Brain, the sport coordinator at Seneca at York. Today we're going to kind of tackle unilateral and bilateral training, the differences between the two, pros and cons of each. Mike's got an awesome background more on the sport-specific side. I'm going to come at that question more from a bodybuilding and strength sport side. So we're going to kind of touch on how to apply them in your own training, why you might want to use it over, one over the other, and touch on the pros and cons. So Mike's going to join in. I'm just going to let him in here. Hey, Mike, how you doing? So this is Mike Brain, as I was saying. He's a sport coordinator at Seneca at York. Mike, I just was kind of giving him a brief intro on the topic and a brief intro on yourself. So I think I'm probably going to take a different, not stance, but kind of bring a different perspective on unilateral versus bilateral training, more from a strength sport and bodybuilding standpoint. And I think you probably have come from more of a sport-specific strength and conditioning standpoint, which will be good. Kind of get two different perspectives.
Yeah.
So we're going to go over kind of unilateral, bilateral training. So first of all, some people, just to kind of clarify what that is, I'm going to just move this up a little bit.
I was going to say, I think you're cut off a bit there.
So unilateral just means you're using one limb. Bilateral is both limbs. So unilateral movement would be something like a split squat, Bulgarian split squat. Bilateral movement would be more traditional, like a regular squat. Same thing in the upper body exercises as well. There's obviously pros and cons for each. From my perspective, I like using unilateral training for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, it's a good balance exercise. From my standpoint, I find it even better for the sport-specific than doing work on a balance board or a BOSU trainer. I think it's actually more sport-specific because there's not a lot of times in sports when the ground just kind of leaves from underneath you, unless you're in a sport like skating. But for most field-based sports, it's going to be a lot better to train unilaterally than to train on, like I said, something like a balance trainer. Or you see these crazy exercises on Swiss balls that really don't have a carryover into a sport-specific arena. I like it because you can actually overload your muscles without loading your spine. So if you take something like a bilateral back squat, you're going to be putting the bar on your back, and you're going to be using a lot of load. What you can do to unload your spine is actually just use a unilateral movement. So like a single leg squat. You can actually move the load around your body, so you can have it more in the front of your body, load it more anteriorly, so you're not putting a lot of stress on the spine, but also you're not using as much weight, but you're actually putting the muscle under the same amount, or if not more stress, because you're only using one limb. So I like it for kind of a deload or a recovery to let your some joints that might get beat up from regular training, bilateral training, obviously for balance as well. For proprioception, I think it helps a lot to kind of when you're squatting off 2 feet, you have a lot more stability. When you switch to 1 foot, you kind of have to know where your body is during that movement, and you're more in tune with your body. Especially if you're doing your strength training on a machine.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're just kind of going through the movement. We're not really focused and intentional and knowing what's happening within our body. We're just kind of getting from A to B any way possible. So those are two reasons kind of why I would put them in a program How about yourself, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna maybe try to cut you off there. I think you kind
Hopefully,
of.
hopefully I didn't. Hopefully I didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully I didn't
No. I got some talking points for sure. So yeah, thanks. Welcome, guys. Yeah, so Chris filled you guys in on what the unilateral versus bilateral, and it might sound fancy, but it like literally is just kind of what it says, right? If you think of like unicycle or bicycle, it's the kind of the same thing, right? So. And yeah, I think I would agree with you. Just from myself, as far as not only a preference as far as maybe any training I would do, but some of the background I have working with certain athletes or certain approaches to training. Now, absolutely, both are 100% important, and I would try to, if you can, in a perfect world, is to do both. With bilateral training, with doing like back squats and traditional deadlifts, or the big three, right? Your bench press, your deadlift, and your squat. Those are your three most important movements in a weight room, right? Like the foundation's there, the strength, the extension, building the muscle and the strength in the hips is so important. And without that, we just wouldn't have that same kind of strength or that ability, especially when it comes to athletic movements. So those are definitely important, and especially when it comes to traditional kind of weightlifting and bodybuilding, or focusing on certain weaknesses that you might have that you want to strengthen. But yeah, I have a little bit more, obviously, with the unilateral. I would say I had a couple workshops with you guys a couple weeks ago regarding functional training, and actually on November 17th, once we start doing our Train with the Trainer, I'll do some kind of unilateral approach to the functional training workshop that I'll be doing for you guys. And like Chris had said, it's really, it's not so much standing on a ball and balancing and juggling at the same time, which you might see some funny stuff in a gym, and you'll kind of go like, what's this guy doing, right? He thinks he's or she's functional training. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do this kind of circus act of an exercise. It's really just working in different planes of movement. So, and what I mean by that is you're not just kind of standing stationary on 2 feet, lifting up and down in one direction. You want to try to incorporate different movements, both lateral, up and down, forwards and backwards, rotationally, things like that you would want to kind of incorporate. And traditionally, when you're doing unilateral work, you have to obviously balance and have coordination and stability in order to counteract working on one leg. So I would think that a couple of the benefits that you'd really want to get from the unilateral training is what we'd, I guess, call neural or neuromuscular adaptation, which is basically kind of what you had said with proprioception, which is your mind and muscles working together to kind of fix imbalances and kind of almost engage tiny little muscles that you wouldn't quite get by having both feet on the ground. So obviously there's benefits to this. I mean, if you look at sports, yeah, obviously you're never going to be standing on a ball balancing while playing a sport. But unilateral movements will be a little bit more realistic when it comes to certain movements like kicking and running, because when you're running, you're landing on one foot at a time. So obviously you'll have to have the balance there. So without rambling on, those were kind of some of the points that you'd want to kind of distinguish between the two. And an example I always love is try to carry a bucket of water in one hand. And it's actually harder to carry one on only one side of your body. I don't know when you'd have the opportunity to do this, but let's say groceries. You're going to carry 3 bags of groceries in one hand, and you're going to kind of be like this, right? It's going to be pulling you down on one side. So that other side has to work to pull it back up. Whereas if you had 2 bags in each hand, although heavier, technically easier. So that's kind of, I guess, a real life example of what the difference between the two are. So, and then, yeah, maybe we can talk about more on that.
That's awesome. It brings up a good point. And the adaptations in the core, right? Because you're fighting all those forces to stabilize, and when you have an equal weight on each side, it doesn't take much to stabilize yourself, but there's a lot going on when you're only on one limb when you're performing an exercise. Even even upper body exercises, doing one limb at a time, you're fighting off flexion and extension, rotation. So that's an awesome point. Like you can actually get a lot of ab work done, core work done, doing unilateral exercise. So you can save a lot of time. You don't have to do specific ab work at the end of your session because you built it in using those unilateral movements. So that's a really good point. Most of the time when you do those, especially like lower body exercises, if you're doing things like a Bulgarian split squat, especially depending on where you're holding the weight, it's really hard on the core. Like you'll feel it the next day, your abs, your lower back, your obliques, everywhere, right? So that's an awesome point. It's less time in the gym is always good.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I was going to just touch on that as well. The soreness that you're talking about. Sometimes when you do some of the functional training, you kind of feel a little bit different kind of soreness or DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, than you would doing traditional bilateral exercises. And it's not necessarily because you lifted more weight or you did higher intensity. It's that what we call agonist and antagonist muscle groups working together. So when you're doing an exercise, for example, like a split squat, usually when you do a regular kind of lunge, certain parts of your leg aren't as active. But when you're doing unilateral, it now has to be engaged, and that's for the balancing, and it you'll feel that a little bit differently as far as the soreness than you would doing kind of traditional stuff.
Absolutely. Glutes for sure. Because you're glute stabilizing the knee, right?
Yeah.
It's main function. So it's always if you want to work those glutes, unilateral is the way to go for sure. You don't get that same glute activation during a squat because your knee's your glutes are trying to stabilize your knee. So it's another good point is that you'll feel those DOMs and other little areas that you're not used to. I do like bilateral. Like, it's not to say you should never do any bilateral movements. It does take a lot of time. If you want to set your program up and you're going to be doing everything unilaterally, that's a lot of time, right? So it's basically twice the amount of time because you have to do twice the amount of reps. If you're tight on time, just pick one or two exercises and do those unilaterally because it does eat up a lot of time. So I will say bilateral is it's a lot quicker to do.
Yeah, for sure.
And you can you can usually load up a lot more bilaterally. Another, I guess, advantage for unilateral work is that you're working both sides of the body with the same amount of weight. So when you're doing a bench press and you're using a straight bar and you're doing it bilaterally, who really knows how much that weight is divided up between the muscles, right?
Right.
When you're doing it unilaterally, you know exactly what weight the body is supporting. If you're using 50-pound dumbbells, then it's 50 pounds on both sides. So it's another advantage for sure.
Yeah. It's almost like using dumbbells versus a barbell for bench press. You kind of get that individual a load that you feel a little bit differently on each side. And I think that would kind of be my last point is, and kind of what you were saying regarding the time. Obviously, it's going to take you a lot longer to do the unilateral because you've got to do both sides. And typically, if I do a workout, it's shorter for that reason because I can only do 2 or 3 of those type of exercises. And then before you know it, it's 45 minutes. So that's why it's almost kind of important to do both and set days aside where you can kind of try your hand in both of them. But I would say doing unilateral, it'll help you recognize imbalances that you might have, which is great for a form of therapy for you. If you have an injury, typically a therapist will get you to do a certain exercise. Usually it's a squat or assessing your gait or how you walk, and they can kind of determine one side is weaker or tighter than the other. And when you're doing, let's say, a Bulgarian split squat, it feels a lot harder on one side, and you can kind of pinpoint that weakness. And that's even myself, and I have like really bad stuff on my left side. So my IT band, my left glute is just a lot weaker. So you'll recognize that, and at least you can kind of you can acknowledge that, and then try to balance it so that when you do the bilateral exercises, you're getting the most out of it. So that's, for me, it's good for just kind of self-awareness and self-assessment, is to kind of see, whoa, like it's a lot harder on that side. So another kind of important part of it.
Awesome. I'll add one more thing, is I guess the difference in this CNS fatigue, right, between the two. When you're using super heavy weights, bilateral movements, you're usually going to be under a lot more stress than if you unloaded the movement a little bit, but loaded the muscle sufficiently. It's another good perk of breaking it up. So like you don't necessarily have to do it every session. Maybe every third session you deload and you do some unilateral movements instead.
Yeah.
You don't have to make it an everyday thing or an either or thing, right?
Yeah.
It's good to mix it in, because your body's going to adapt to it pretty quick. It might be pretty awkward the first couple of sessions, especially the lower body movements. They'll be awkward to do, and you're really going to have to concentrate and focus on every rep. But it's like any skill, right? You practice, you get stronger, and it'll get easier and easier each session. So don't get too discouraged if you can't get to the bottom position of a split squat, or a one-legged deadlift, or whatever exercise you're using, because it does take some practice and coordination. Your muscles have to learn to work in that different pattern. So take your time with it. Would you suggest that a beginner start with a bilateral and mix in some unilateral work, or would you prefer to see them right off the bat start with unilateral work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say in most cases, for a beginner, for someone just starting like a strength training routine, if you're going to go right into the kind of functional training style unilateral work where you're doing one-legged exercises, the issue is that there's now a prerequisite for what you're doing when it comes to not just your strength abilities, but what we had discussed earlier, which is your balance and coordination. So you could be really strong and have that foundation where you can properly do the squat before you progress to something more difficult. But if you don't have that kind of balance and coordination and posture and all the form that goes into the unilateral exercises, you could be doing it incorrectly. I'd suggest to build up the strength and the balance first before you move into doing the unilateral movements. But there are easier ones. Like we said, it's not just balancing on a ball, one-legged while lifting 200 pounds. It doesn't have to be like that. Even just kind of even doing any kind of one-handed dumbbell exercise, if you just do a one-armed shoulder press as opposed to two at the same time, I mean, that technically is unilateral. It's not what you'd think when you think of functional training, but your body now is having to balance a little different and engage the core so that this side isn't kind of out of whack. So I would suggest, start with the bilateral foundation of doing the proper deadlift and squat and some form of pressing movement, and build up your balance before you do the unilateral. But if you have the balance, then you can attempt them. But you want to make sure you're doing them correctly. Otherwise, you're kind of just going through the motions. Okay,
cool.
Yeah.
What would be your favorite two bilateral movements?
Oh,
do you have a favorite?
I mean, I'd like to say like a pull up, as opposed to a one-armed row, just because I think that, and you'll agree that you're just like, it's just such a beneficial exercise if you're able to do like full pull-ups. But I'm at the moment not able to do that many. But if I could, that would be one that would be a challenge for me, would be that. And then also like a modified deadlift, like a trap bar deadlift would probably be my go-to if I was at a gym right now. And then what about yourself?
So the trap bar deadlift, so you would have one leg raised behind you? Or?
Oh, sorry, I thought we were talking just bilateral. You're talking unilateral?
Sorry, yes, unilateral.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah.
Yes, I meant unilateral.
Yeah. Okay, then bilateral is just bicep curl. No, I'm just unilateral. Oh, that's a tough one. I have so many. It's kind of like asking someone what their favorite song is by their favorite band, right? Kind of like you just can't pinpoint it. Yeah, I would say anything that involves 2 or 3 different movements where you are doing both a lower body, upper body, and core exercise. So I'm big on any kind of rotational movement. So I would say, yeah, like a Bulgarian split squat with a medicine ball where you're, or even doing against the wall, that kind of thing. Like that's the stuff I like where I feel like I'm getting the biggest bang for your buck. Or a landmine exercises. So for those of you that don't know what the landmine is, basically it's an Olympic barbell that you've kind of attached into the, I guess into a corner or into an actual device. And it kind of pivots. And you can do a whole range of different exercises, a lot of kind of functional exercises where you're doing like a squat and press on one side, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of stuff I really miss about not having the gym. That would be the first thing that I would do. So how about yourself?
I would probably say most bang for your buck. A dumbbell, either a dumbbell clean, unilateral, so you're using one hand, or a snatch. And that's good because it's going to work a bit of your lower body, upper body, core. It's a push and a pull. So I like that for sure. And then like a heavy barbell jerk, which is same thing. You're going to be working your hips. You're going to be loading your hips, lower body, more explosive, crazy. Your core is working crazy to stabilize and transfer force from the ground up. And then locking out as well. So those are my 2 favorite for sure. Something that kind of covers all your bases. Yeah.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you very much for popping in.
Yeah.
We'll have to get a unilateral session in. Who knows? Maybe for the train the trainer. We'll cook something up. But I appreciate you coming by, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for joining, guys. Have any questions about anything that we touched on? Just shoot me or Mike a message. We'll be happy to answer.
Awesome.
Alrighty.
See you
Have a good one.
See ya.
Take care.